We're going to jump in. We're going to jump into yours next. Are you good? Are you ready? Okay, next on our agenda is the UPPAC process review, task force report. The task force chair is Vice Chair Brittany Cummins, so we'll have her move down there to the end of the table and give us an update. And Vice Chair Brittany Cummins, and then at the end of your report, there's a motion that needs to come before a board, so I'll pay attention to that. I'll take an hour, but then we're going to have to.
We've got to watch our time, sir.
I've got that too. But. Okay, Angie, you need your mic on too, or are you gonna?
Yes.
Let's make sure they're all.
Okay, the task force recommendation is contained in your packet. We have it also projected for your reading enjoyment. The UPPAC task force met, if you'll see in your executive summary, was established by the board, and there were a couple of reasons why it was established. There was a lawsuit as well as a state audit, and all of that's contained in your report, so just that for background. And the task force was organized, and we had several things that we were asked to look at. You'll see those. Number one, the role of the overall fairness of the UPPAC process from flagging to final action and notification. Two, the role of proportionality and consistency. Three, the role of aggravating and mitigating factors. Four, is the board like an appeals board? And five, is an appeal to the superintendent necessary for judicial review? And then based on the audit, we also looked at consideration of credit for time served, or excuse me, that wasn't part of the audit, that was a board member who requested that, as well as consideration of recommendations from the recent audit. And so the task force was large and fantastic, had representatives from all different parts of the educational world, and we were facilitated by a retired judge, Judge Sandra Puller, who was fantastic at keeping us all in line. So it was a fantastic experience to go through this process of looking at this. And as you'll notice, most of the recommendations are going to come to the board in the form of a rule. And so we're not asking you to approve these rule recommendations today, because those rules will go through committee as we normally hear rules, and it will have opportunity for public input on those rules. But we're asking, the approval process is, or the recommendations that we have before you that we would like you to approve are to move those rules as they are and recommended from this committee into that process. The recommendations, I was excited to have this large write-up of this particular recommendations, because as you've read, there's explanation and reason behind all of the recommendations that we have sent to you. And so you're welcome to read through it. We won't go through it in detail today, but we will read through each recommendation. And the motion would be today to accept the recommendations from the UPPAC task force. So the first recommendation is the revised educator standards of professional conduct to include only mandatory referrals. And so all of this took place in a rule revision, and so it's in one of the rules, 515, in Rule 515 and 516. And 217. And so those are part of that rule. So it was basically, let's make sure that anything that is in our rule is a mandatory report. There was a lot of inconsistency across the state about LEAs judging the discretionary places where we may report certain things. And so it was not equitable across the state as to what was reported to UPAC. And so we made sure that anything that was in these UPAC rules were mandatory, that they be mandatorily reported. So that's recommendation number 1. Do you want to take questions on each one? Or through? We'll go through the whole thing, and if you have any questions, we can come back to each recommendation. So next was clarify the process for UPAC, considering when to actually open a UPAC case file. And so there were some clarifications added to rule as to how a case would be considered and when it would be opened by UPAC. Reduce or take into consideration the length of time between UPAC opening cases and final action by the board when determining discipline. And so there was some recommendations that included an expedited hearing process and looking at time served recommendations, which are also recommended in rule. Next is inform board members of the parameters in board rule when taking final action and the legal principles applicable to judicial review. So we talked about the board's role in reviewing UPAC cases. And so one of the things that we talked about was training the board and informing the board what are our boundaries, what is our lane in making recommendations that, or deciding on recommendations that come from UPAC. And so we talked about the board's assistant attorneys general and staff provide periodic training to the board, as well as during our discussions on UPAC, reminding us of certain obligations or rules or laws that apply to situations that we may be deciding on. Okay, next was eliminate the superintendent review process. This was seen to be unnecessary, and so it was just basically just removed, stricken from the rules. Additional recommendations that were not necessarily, well, were contained in rules, some of them. The first bullet was renaming the letter of admonishment to a letter of education and clarifying that this letter differs from letters of warning or letters of warning. So it was basically taking it out of the reprimand status and it becomes a letter of education, basically for anything that comes to UPAC that there's not enough evidence to show that something actually happened, but there may be lead to a problem in the future. The second bullet is clarifying definitions for boundary violations and removing grooming terminology from the rules. And so this was to clarify the wording and how these things are applied. The concerning behaviors are currently identified as boundary violations, and so we didn't need the additional term of grooming that often creates confusion. The next recommendation, adding provisions to Rule 277-215, allowing UPAC and the board to utilize mitigating considerations if an educator receives and successfully fulfills the conditions of a plea in abeyance for misconduct that result in criminal charges. Okay, so there's a lot of discussion on how the plea in abeyance fit into this process. Okay, next, consolidating the LEA misconduct reporting rule into one location where they were previously spread out through two rules. So we added a little bit of clarity and tried to bring things in more clearly. Requiring UPAC staff to prepare a written guide for pro se educators to assist them when they represent themselves in the UPAC investigative hearing process. And so it's providing a little bit better access for those who do not have or pay for representation on if they're planning to represent themselves, giving them the ability and the knowledge that they need to represent themselves. Clarifying the presumptions rule. What misconduct warrants a reprimand as opposed to a letter of warning, and this includes misconduct that falls under the lowest presumption. So we clarified there. Numerous technical changes throughout the UPAC process, including updates to the UPAC presumptions. So that pretty much takes care of what was contained in the rules that will go through committee. Next is a training request. So educators need comprehensive training regarding educator professional conduct and discipline. There was 2 recommendations here. They're not jumping out at me. The task force. Yes, please.
Yes.
I can't. Sorry.
And so the task force, you may remember also that part of the audit that the state auditor did recognize that many educators are not aware of their conduct requirements or their standards as well as the reporting requirements. So one of the recommendations stated here is that the board prioritize a funding request for an external for us to go through a request for proposals process to create a new training requirement. It could be an interactive, like a training, a web-based training or module. And so you'll see later today in the business cases, a request for a UPPAC ethics training. It's about $600,000, and that's based on a prior request for information that the office did. So that's one of the funding recommendations, or the training recommendation, is to prioritize that, to request that funding from the legislature for an ethics program. And that would be done at initial licensure and then required every time relicensure happens for educators.
The task force is also requesting that the UPPAC continue to gather some of the data that they used to inform the committee, that information be available to the board as questions come up as we do our work in regard to UPPAC cases. And so they will continue to, that's part of the recommendations, is that they can continue to gather that data. And also that the task force reconvene in 1 year from the implementation of these rules to address any concerns that might have come up throughout a year regarding the changes to these rules.
And then last, we did review the state auditor's recommendations as stated there and made no specific recommendations, although it influenced many of the amendments throughout the rules.
Correct. So if there are any questions, we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have regarding these recommendations.
Board Member Belknap.
Thank you, Chair. I have a lot, but I'll just start with two, and then maybe someone will ask my other ones, if that's okay.
You have a lot of,
Questions. I'll just start with two, and then I'll see if somebody
Okay, thank
else
you.
asks. Thank you. So my question is, was there a discussion on how often the board would receive this training, or is it going to be as needed or as it comes up?
There was not a discussion on often. It was just a periodic training, I would imagine, as we cycle through and have new board members come on, it would be available. Part of that intent was as needed training. So sometimes we receive information as we need it. So if we are speaking in a way or asking a certain question, we may receive some immediate training from our AAGs that might answer the appropriateness of that action, or, where does that fall? What are the risks of moving in that direction from our AAGs?
Kind of like what we've had.
Correct. So it could be immediate training, like that's just informal, as needed, and as well as the importance of receiving some more formal training on what are some of the boundaries that we need to stay in as we make decisions regarding UPPAC cases.
you.
and then your second?
One more. You talked to, is it okay if I direct this?
Yes, please.
Thank you to the chair of the task force. I still am concerned about the clarity of presumptions here, that you talked a little bit about, that you tried to clarify some of the presumptions, knowing how different every case is. How are we literally clarifying presumptions, because there's all kinds of mitigating circumstances?
Yes, yeah, and I think that's always going to be the situation, because every case is going to be different. And so we tried to add as much clarity to the presumptions as possible, and that those discussions will happen as the rules come before committee, if there's something specific that you'd like to speak to. But we also talked about the importance of those mitigating and aggravating, thank you, the mitigating and aggravating factors that play into each case. And so we tried to add some clarity to those mitigating and aggravating factors and how they play into the decision-making process, as well as our use as a board of those our consideration of those mitigating and aggravating factors when things come to us. And so how do we take into consideration what was proposed as a mitigating or an aggravating factor in a case?
Thank you.
So.
Okay. Board Member Bolter?
Thank you. I have had concerns about UPAC since I've been elected to the state school board, because it's a judicial system basically for our teachers and educators and administrators, and we already have a judicial system. And so I'm trying to figure out what's that line where we sit as judge and jury, and my concerns grew after the case in St. George, in my school district, where a teacher was given a letter of warning, which now I guess would be a letter of education if this goes through. And for 30-plus years, he was molesting children and is now going to jail, 15-plus counts. And so my question is, what's the line where we say, okay, parents, if there's a great concern, do not let it go through the UPAC system because they're just going to return back to the classroom. I'm just concerned, and we've read many cases where it's similar to that, or red flags or things like that. And I know that we're over teacher licensing, but shouldn't it go through the judicial system and then based off of what a judge rules in an open public case, then come to us and say, okay, now what's the action? So I'm just wondering, what is the case? And you're shaking your head that no, it wouldn't be a letter of education. But I'm just saying that when he received that letter of warning, if it had been what it is now, it would have been a letter of education, or would it have been something more severe then?
Okay.
So
And why wasn't he
I will
referred?
try to
Yeah.
clarify 2 points, and I'm not a UPAC expert, so somebody else. But the letter of education is actually taking the place of the letter of admonishment, not the letter of warning. Letter of warning is a reprimand that is on your UPAC. A letter of admonishment is not. So we're just changing the name of that admonishment to a letter of education. So that's where that is, and so it wouldn't change that in any particular specific case. And then I guess the task force didn't address kind of the philosophy of things, but just knowing that there are parallel things that go on in our system. UPAC is only about licensing. These things take place parallel in the judicial system. And so cases that, it's not, parents don't have to decide which one to use. They use both. And it's not a parent's decision always, or although parents can make reports to UPAC as well as to the judicial system. Excuse me, the
And just-
judicial system. They're parallel programs that do have different functions.
And what's before the board right now are the recommendations after approximately how many hours of lots of dialogue?
30+.
How many?
30 plus, yeah, so.
30 plus hours, and it isn't a perfect document, and that's why it's coming to you the way that it is now, and will be moved to committee and more discussion, and of course, there's some background on it where there's a few board members that have served on that task force that can speak to some of those comments. So we're not approving changes to the rule or anything. It's here's the recommendations, and then we will go from there. I'm losing my voice here. Board member Cindy Davis.
This is more a comment than a question, but I read in one of these many attachments, I don't remember which one now, the removal of the word grooming. And I just, this will sound like I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth, but I understand removing it for the fact that not every boundary violation results in grooming, but I'm concerned because in every instance of grooming, there were boundary violations. So I'm just asking, as on public record, as we look at these ethics programs, to consider that we're careful and we that's included, that a lot of these boundary violations, as they escalate, do in fact lead to grooming and can lead to abuses.
Correct, and the discussion followed that exact train of thought. So grooming usually isn't identified until after you see the pattern or something happens that shows, oh, yes, those boundary violations were grooming. And while grooming is still a word that we use, it's when something is reported to UPAC, it's a boundary violation, whether it ends up at some point being grooming or not. And yes, many boundary violations do end up being grooming patterns, but they are still boundary violations. And so if we take out the confusion of was it or was it not grooming, which is difficult to identify depending on when it was reported to UPAC or the severity of, the end point. Sorry, I'm not explaining it very well. But yes, so it was the idea of all of them are boundary violations, and when they're reported as a boundary violation, which may lead to grooming patterns or sometimes have been grooming patterns.
Okay. Follow-up.
Just really quick.
Again, we're not in committee, so.
Right, okay,
we're
so
gonna
just a
fix
quick
that.
follow-up. The boundary violations themselves are isolated incidents. Collectively, they can be grooming, and so they can be a bit different, but I'm done.
So,
Thank
and
you.
we spoke about that in regard to aggravating items. What's the aggravating items? And so if something happens in a pattern, it's aggravated by that. And so if there are many boundary violations, while we might not call it, we may even use the term grooming, but in the standard, it doesn't necessarily say it because it is a pattern of boundary violations, and we could call it grooming, but it is noted as an aggravating factor. Thank you.
Board Member Lear.
Thank you, Chair. In response to Laura and Brittany's exchange just a minute ago about training for board members, I was one of the members of that committee who felt very strongly that the board members needed training. And my opinion and the opinion of a couple of other people on that committee was that that would not be just not only an off-the-cuff or correction during a discussion, but that there would be more formal training opportunity where the AAGs could speak to the board about some of the decisions that are made and how they're made, and if they're based on evidence or if they're based on opinion. And my feeling is that, and we didn't, unfortunately, from my perspective in the discussion, in the 30-plus hours, we did not get into very much how the board addressed these recommendations. It was more about the UPAC process. And I hope, as one board member, that there will be more formalized training that is more interactive for board members.
Board Member Jenny Earl.
So my question, I guess I'm just looking for clarification, and maybe I didn't get through every one of the rules on there. I got through a couple of them. I'm usually try to be pretty thorough, but I apologize, I didn't get through all of them. So, and this goes back a little bit to Michelle. So for clarification, if someone is turned in for UPAC or there's an incident that occurs, at what obligation does a school, at what point do they know to also turn that into legal authorities? In other words, do we have that outlined here, or is there a way for them to know this isn't just, I'm going to turn it into UPAC and they're going to make a recommendation? Is there when we're talking about two entities moving forward on this, is there a point where they know that this isn't just that there should be some additional legal things going on for districts and for schools?
You want me to answer that? So I guess the question is, there are certain criminal, reporting requirements, especially related to child sexual abuse. If there are allegations related to sexual abuse of children, those are required to be reported to officials, to law enforcement, and that would be handled separately. Of course, those same allegations would likely also result in either suspension or revocation of a license. So the rules really they are in many ways and almost always related to the UPAC process. Whether there are other laws, even our own board rules at times, especially again related to reports of sexual abuse of children, are separate from the licensure rules. So I don't know if I'm completely answering your question, but is part of your question whether as we're training administrators on the reporting requirements for licensure, that we also provide some training on.
I guess I'm asking if that's ongoing. So,
And that might be,
because it would seem like the two would need to take place, not just licensure. If we know we have a concern here with licensure, it would seem that the other would need to be followed through with as well. On the,
And board members, I think we're kind of getting outside of the task force recommendations and getting into proposed solutions and clarity on roles and all of that. So I kind of want to keep us in the context of what we're doing here. Now we're talking about UPPAC, the way it is today. So please answer the question, but
So Ben Rasmussen, Director of Law and Professional Practices. Just, Member Earl, we do reinforce the statutory reporting requirements in the educator standards rule that we're proposing. And we make every effort to train on that on an ongoing basis as we have opportunity.
Board Member Belknap?
Thank you, Chair. I'm not going to do my others because I think that's right. It needs to go back to committee, but I would like to just take the opportunity, because I've done these task force before, for the time and effort of the board members and those who served on this task force, and also for the judge who helped support this group, and appreciate all the hard work they've done.
Okay. Vice Chair Brittany Cummings, you have a motion?
Sure,
Well,
yes.
maybe I'll just do
Yeah,
it like this.
I
I'm
would
seeking a motion to accept. What's that? But did I hear the whole motion, or that? I didn't accept your motion, but, so it was your motion to accept the UPPAC process review task force recommendations?
Yes.
Do we have a second? Quite a few seconds, Mark Marsh. Any further discussion? Board Member Hanson?
Just a clarification, so we are just going to accept them in general, and that very specific changes can still be made in committee,
They will
right?
they'll go to committee, and all of that work will begin and process.
Can I clarify that?
Yes.
So the recommendations that are contained in rule would go to committee. The items that would be passed as a recommendation here today would be the request for ethics training, the request for UPPAC to continue to gather the data that they were using to inform the task force, the board member training for board members, and the reconvening of the committee in a year after the rules go into effect. So those are the four that would, the recommendations that would go into effect outside of the rulemaking process.
Which some things can be voted on, modified, et cetera, depending on budget, whatever we've got going on. And again, the end piece of this is, once rules are in place, the task force jumps back in and say, okay, are we still meeting our goals and objectives? Okay. Not seeing any further discussion to the motion. The motion before the board is the board approve the UPPAC process review task force recommendations. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Voting is unanimous. Thank you, and we'll get thank yous out to all of the task force members. Okay, we're at lunch. Right now, we have lunch break. We have a time certain at 1:30.